Cable management is important. It's one of the things that separates the rookies from the pros in PC building. You can have the most expensive, flashy gaming chassis with as many case fans as your CPU has cores. Without good cable management, it's still going to look a mess. Plus, it just looks better when there aren't cables covering your centerpiece graphics card and RGB lighting. Whatever the case, cable management is important, and that's why we've compiled a list of our top 10 tips for managing the cables in your gaming rig. Our first tip is to pick a chassis that makes things easy. Now, there are plenty of good cases to choose from, but there are a few things you should look for. When choosing a case for cable management, you should go for one that has gaps and rubber grommets in the backplate that will let you pass cables through from the back to the front. If the case has tie-down points and a cable management bar, then even better. You should also look for one with a basement or shroud for your power supply, so that you can pass power cables around the back of the motherboard plate instead of leaving them lying out naked in front. And finally, at the risk of stating the obvious, bigger cases will generally be easier to cable manage. Bigger case, more room for cables, you get the idea. There are plenty of cases that are great for cable management, from more expensive and feature-rich options like NZXT's H510 Elite, to mid-range options like Fractal Design's Define R6, to the budget options like Corsair's Carbide 275R. There are cases that can make cable management that bit easier.
If you don't already have a power supply for your build, you should probably look at getting a modular one. A modular PSU is one that has detachable cables, meaning you can connect only those cables that you'll actually need for your build. As far as cable management goes, this means you won't have a bunch of loose cables behind your motherboard's backplate, stopping you from sliding on your side panel. It also makes it easier to work on cable management when you don't have 10 completely unnecessary cables just lying around. You can also get semi-modular power supplies, which do have some permanently attached component cables, but these cables are usually only the essential ones that you wouldn't want to remove anyway.
Make sure you have lots and lots of cable ties. You can get 100 velcro cable ties from Amazon for less than £10, and it's definitely worth getting some if you haven't got any already. Some cases will come with cable ties, but it can never hurt to have too many, and it can sometimes hurt to not have enough. And it's also worth spending a little extra money on the velcro ones over the standard zip or twist ties. Velcro ones are reusable and easy to use, and they also reduce the risk of cutting into any other wires inside the PC.
Possibly the most important thing to understand about good cable management is that you need to have a plan. It's no good connecting all your components and just hoping it'll all work out. You need to be thinking about how you're going to go about routing your cables before you begin. There are some things that you should be thinking about when planning your build. First, if you're working on a PC system that's already been built, it's probably going to be easier to completely disconnect everything and start fresh with your cable management. First, figure out exactly which cables you'll need for your build. If you're using a modular power supply, remove all the other cables that you won't need and do what you want with them. I'd recommend actually keeping them though, since you never know what you'll need in the future, but you could chuck them in the bin if you want. If you're not using a modular power supply, you should still figure out which cables you need, and then you can separate these from the rest. You can even tie up those cables that you don't need with a Velcro cable tie. This will keep them out of your way while you're fiddling around with all the other cables that you're actually using. You should also figure out which backplate cutouts you're going to use for routing cables to different components. Choose cutouts that are close to each component, but don't have too many going through the same one. You need the cables to be able to actually fit through, remember? If you have all this figured out beforehand, it'll be much easier when you get down to it.
Speaking of components, don't forget that case fans can be removed and rotated. It might sometimes be useful to do this because rotating a fan can make its connecting cable either further away from or closer to the fan header on the motherboard or closest cable tidy route. If there's enough cable to let you rotate the fan and have the cable travel a little further around the edges of the fan's frame, this can let you wrap the cable around the frame and connect it to the header while keeping things neat and tidy. Otherwise, tucking the cable down the side of the fan's frame is usually a good idea, and you can fold it up and tie it a little if needed. Figuring out which way to rotate a fan might take a bit of experimenting, but it's one of those small things that can turn good cable management into great cable management.
Don't just plug in your cables in any old order. Start with the non-power supply cables first. These would be the case fans, CPU fan, front panel connections, and any component to motherboard cables like SATA. Basically, leave the power supply cables until last. If you do it this way, you'll have an easier time figuring out which are the best routes around your case for the power supply cables. Plus, component to motherboard connections are pretty easy and generally aren't too difficult to manage. It's usually pretty obvious what the best cable routes will be for those. Getting these out of the way first lets you focus on the more difficult stuff without any distraction. After these are done, you can start on the power supply cables, and the chunkier the better. There's nothing worse than having one final 24-pin motherboard power connector left and realizing you haven't left enough room to feed it through the backplate, so starting with the bigger cables, make sure this doesn't happen.
When deciding on the best routes for your cables, there are a few things you need to consider. First and most important thing is that you want every cable to travel the shortest possible distance from when it feeds through the backplate to when it connects to its component. You also want to give it just enough slack that it won't be difficult to swap out components in the future. It can be a tough balancing act. You also want to be routing cables in a way that they can be grouped together whenever possible. 3 cables running a single route is a lot neater than 3 cables going their own way. There's a balancing act with this one too, because you need to make sure that each grouping of cables will fit through wherever it is you're feeding it through on the backplate. If there aren't any backplate cutouts for you to feed the cables through, your best bet will be to route things around the contours of the case. This is better than having them stretched across your components. In this situation, it's worth sacrificing the keep the cable length short rule and using as much cable as needed to get it tucked into those corners.
You should be especially careful to not obstruct any fans, heatsinks or coolers with cables, as this could significantly impact their lifespan. Yep, that's literally it for this tip.
Once you've got everything plugged in and patiently waiting to be turned on, you should take a moment to organise the cables behind the backplate. I know no one's going to see how amazingly neat and tidy this part of your PC is, but it's important. And you'll know in your heart. Try to use the full length of each cable without bunching them up. Group them together and route them around the edges of the case in as orderly of a fashion as possible. Different cases will also have different routing options for behind the panel, so make sure you make use of any cable management bars and follow routes that seem logical for your case. Having good cable management behind the motherboard plate not only means you'll actually be able to close the case's side panel, but it'll also make life easier in future if you ever need to upgrade and reorganise things.
Our final tip is to only tie your cables together or to the case once you've connected everything up and have the cables roughly where you want them. This way you can make sure everything is exactly how you want it to be before you make any cable commitments. Sometimes, despite all your rigorous planning, you'll realise after plugging everything in that one particular cable would be much better feeding through another slot. Leaving the ties until the end makes this less of a hassle. It's not the most exciting thing in the world, but if you spent a chunk of money on a gaming rig, you can probably afford half an hour to keep it looking neat and tidy too. Well, if you've liked today's video, give us a like, subscribe, make sure to ring that bell. If you don't, they'll come for us. Also check back on PCGamesN.com for more on hardware and gaming. See you next time.